Well, a potential arms race is now brewing over the civil war in Syria. Israel's defense minister says his nation's military is prepared to strike Russian weapons shipments to the Syrian government. That warning comes after a top Russian official said his nation reserves the right to provide Syria with advanced air defense missile systems, similar to this one. Israeli officials have repeatedly voiced concerns that Syrian weapons could end up in the hands of their enemies, including the militant group Hezbollah. All this as the United States and Russia try to bring the Assad regime and opposition leaders to Switzerland for talks. And one day after the European Union agreed to lift its arms embargo on the rebels. The Fox Reports chief correspondent Jonathan Hunt is live with more. And Jonathan, this spat between Israel and Russia could be extremely significant.
Extremely significant and extremely dangerous, Trace. The Russian missiles are S-300s. They're anti-aircraft missiles, and obviously they are of great concern to the Israelis because they could be used by the Syrian government to attack Israeli warplanes. They could also be funneled from the Syrian government to Hezbollah in Lebanon, who then in turn would use them against Israeli forces. For that reason, the Israeli defense minister said today, quote, "If, God forbid, they do reach Syria, we will know what to do." And of course, Israel has already shown its willingness to carry out airstrikes inside Syria against missile shipments that they say were headed directly to Hezbollah militants in southern Lebanon. Trace.
And it seems, Jonathan, there really is a certain irony here that the Russians are being highly critical of the European nations supplying weapons to the Syrian opposition.
Yeah, on the one hand, the Russians are saying we will continue to fulfill our contracts to arm the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad, while criticizing a move by the European Union to now allow European nations that want to send weapons directly to the rebels. State Department officials were asked about this today at their daily news briefing. They didn't want to be drawn on what's saying outright that arming the rebels is a good idea. Listen.
Our position is that we want a negotiated political settlement, but we want Assad to have a changed calculation so that he realizes that he's got to negotiate so that we can get a transitional executive body.
Meantime, Senator John McCain, who has, of course, been hawkish on Syria throughout, has added to the pressure on the Obama administration to aid the rebels by making an unannounced visit across the border from Turkey into Syria to meet with some of those rebels yesterday. There is no sign, though, that that pressure is working. No indications at the moment that the U.S. is about to change its policy and actually start funneling weapons to the Syrian opposition. Trace.
The Fox Reports chief correspondent Jonathan Hunt live for us in New York. Jonathan, thank you. Joining us now is John Bussey. He is the assistant managing editor and executive business editor for the Wall Street Journal newspaper, which is owned by our parent company. And John, really the same first question to you as with Jonathan, because you talk about Israel making threats about Russian arms shipments to Syria. How, in your estimation, does that escalate this?
Well, it escalates it because both sides now are talking about funneling ever more sophisticated weapons into a very dangerous spot in the world. And the Europeans and the Americans are looking at this and saying, okay, well, how do we get some kind of advantage for the rebels that we like as opposed to the rebels that we don't like? Remember, there are Islamist extremists who have funneled into Syria who are fighting Assad. These are people that the Europeans and Americans do not want to get weapons. So America and France and Britain particularly are saying we want to get Assad to the bargaining table, but we have to give some leverage to the rebels. That means if we signal that there might be more weapons coming to the rebels, that gives them power at the negotiating table. But the reality behind that's really tough because the Americans and the French and the British are having trouble finding the right rebels to get the more sophisticated weapons to.
How do you get Assad to the bargaining table, John, when he's got the firepower, when he's got the bigger guns? I mean, what is he going to go to the bargaining table for? If he knows that he can outgun the rebels for the next couple of years, why would he say, okay, let's talk about this?
Yeah, and that's the biggest concern to the West, particularly if this air defense system is put into place, which would preclude any kind of no-fly zone creation or would make it a lot more difficult. And the French are saying, and the Americans too, that, well, one thing that could counterbalance the fact that Assad is using his Air Force more effectively now against the rebels are shoulder-held anti-aircraft missiles. Well, how do you get those to the right people and make sure that they don't get to al-Qaeda-linked groups that could use them not just in Syria, but in some other theater as well?
John Bussey with the Wall Street Journal. John, good to see you. Thank you, sir.